In the U.S. Labor Share of Income, What Shocks Matter by Ivan, Codrina, Rudy, Rüdiger von Arnim, and Marcia Sanstetti, what we're trying to do is to develop a deeper understanding of the changing dynamics of the U.S. labor share of income. We begin our analysis by emphasizing that the labor share is actually a complex endogenous variable that reacts to changes in production in labor markets. And our analysis is at the aggregate level. So we emphasize the importance of macroeconomic shocks over two different periods. The first one being the immediate post-war era, starting from 1948 until the mid-1980s. And then during the neoliberal era, starting since the 1980s. And what our key contribution is essentially to use a structural vector autoregression model that is implemented in two steps. So in the first step, we construct the four macroeconomic shocks that we believe are the most important ones to understand the dynamics of the labor share. Aggregate demand shocks, labor supply shocks, shocks to wages, and productivity shocks. And in the second step, what we are trying to do is to see which of these shocks are the most important ones in order that are affecting the dynamics of the labor share of income. And what we are finding is that indeed the dynamics of the labor share have changed. And the most important statistical difference comes from shocks to wages and shocks to productivity. But during the neoliberal era, shocks to wages have become more important rather than shocks to productivity. What this means is that essentially during the neoliberal period, factors that will govern wage setting have become more important rather than factors that govern technological progress, which is a contribution that hasn't been made in the previous literature.
Start by saying first that it's incredibly difficult to empirically investigate long-run changes in macro dynamics in the nature, and for that part in the nature of institutions, partially because we have so few data points. In our paper, we are looking at the golden age and neoliberal era, which are in a way only two data points. Now we get around this issue by assessing the differences in the impulse response functions across these two periods. As Ivan mentioned already, the main results suggest one central important conclusion. Changes in labor market institutions, which in our framework find expression in the identified structural shocks to wages, emerge as likely candidates that could explain the decline in the labor share in the US economy since mid-1980s. Now, in a bit more detail, I think our results suggest that labor successes and, if you want, setbacks in influencing the institutions and policies that govern wage setting. And the proxy of this is, for example, the erosion of the relative bargaining of power of workers takes center stage in the changes in the labor share between the post-war era and the neoliberal era. Now, these results contrast sharply with recent research on changes in the functional distribution of income. For example, the declining importance of productivity shocks in our framework during the neoliberal era raises important questions regarding the explanatory power of technological change, or in general of technology and the role of elasticity or factor substitution as the dominant force. More recently in our work, we have added changes in the structure of the US economy, and specifically in the sectoral structure of the US economy, to the list of factors that may be relevant in understanding the decline in the US labor share. To this end, we have worked on disaggregating the labor share across sectors and across space, and particularly across US states. So far, our results basically reaffirm the emergence of these different macro dynamics across the golden age and the neoliberal eras. We find, for example, that the decline in the labor share of income in the recent decades is overall due to wages lagging labor productivity, primarily in the so-called progressive sectors. And that at the same time, at the sectoral level, manufacturing plays an oversized role in explaining the decline in the aggregate labor share. We also know that the US economy has experienced profound changes in its structure since the 1950s. Now, interestingly, these changes in the structure of the US economy, as captured by employment shifts across sectors, has been towards services sectors that feature higher labor shares, but at the same time, lower levels of labor productivity and lower levels of wages. So while such shifts are expected to buffer the decline in the labor share, in the aggregate labor share, they may have also led to a weakening of the bargaining power of workers, especially in the progressive sectors. And among these progressive sectors, we could mention information, wholesale trade, finance, and manufacturing itself. So in terms of the policy, we think, and future research, we think that changes in the structure of the US economy should make the list of potential explanations for the decoupling of wages from labor productivity growth, and therefore for the overall decline in the labor share. We are also working on connecting these disaggregated perspectives to the dynamics at the macro level, and doing so will relieve some of the data constraints since one has basically a lot more observations across sectors and space.